I used the last 30 minutes essentially to think about how to present something like this in 20 or 25 minutes, and I came up with the solution that it may be good to have a sort of a application of this kind of argument and to focus on a certain debate in order to make clear what I mean with this argument. And when I say I will focus on a debate, I essentially focus on a normative debate. But my argument essentially will be, in order to resolve this normative debate, you need to have some empirical knowledge about the different premises that different normative arguments have. And the normative debate that I just take as a starting point for my argument is essentially the one between, let's say, cosmopolitan theorists of global governance and, let's call the other ones, intergovernmentalist theories of international governance. And I mean, it's pretty daring to start out with this normative issue, given that Michael is sitting here, but I nevertheless try to do it. Cosmopolitan scholars essentially challenge the functioning of international institutions, such as the WTO or the United Nations, since they point to democratic deficits of these institutions, including the lack of identifiable decision makers who are directly accountable for wrong decisions, and of course also for a lack of transparency of the decision making process, in addition with a sort of a permanent argument that this intransparency and this lack of including all those who are affected by the decisions leads to a certain bias in the content of those decisions in favor, essentially, of those actors who have access to these clubs who make those decisions. So cosmopolitans argue against this background of closedness and of biasedness of those decisions, that those international institutions do have significant normative problems. Intergovernmentalists, on the other side, do not subscribe to this view. They essentially argue that international organizations are tightly controlled by member states, that the administrative apparatus of those international institutions is tiny as their budget is, that they do not receive any taxes and that do not get involved in redistributive issues. In that sense, international organizations, so the argument goes, of those guys, can be considered as institutions with more or less delegated authority from sovereign, legitimate governments. They are not a political order, they are more or less technocratic regulatory agencies controlled, tightly controlled by the principals, the states, the legitimate states. This is roughly put the debate. And my argument essentially goes that this debate cannot be resolved, or not easily be resolved, by normative arguments. Underlying is essentially an empirical difference at this point, and the empirical difference is essentially about two issues that, or two statements, let's say two statements from the intergovernmentalists, which can be at least potentially falsified. The first one is international institutions are tightly controlled by its members. That's an empirical statement. If international organizations are prime examples of delegated authority, this implies that international organizations are not considered by their constituencies and by the societies of the world as something political. They need not to be politically legitimate. That would be the second part of the statement. So I mean the two potentially falsifiable statements are, first, those institutions are tightly controlled, and that essentially means everyone and each member has a possibility to control them. And secondly, it means that they are not considered as political institutions from the side of the societies and of the affected people. Those two statements I want to challenge essentially with this argument of the politicization that has been distributed in this paper, and maybe some of you have read. The argument is that those two statements cannot be held because there is a change process going on, a change process that can be described as the silent constitutionalization of norms and rules of international institutions, and as a result of this process, a global political order emerges that requires political legitimation. That is essentially the argument. The first part is a process of deepening of international institutions going on, is a process going on which implies that those institutions are not any longer tightly controlled by the member governments. The original idea of international institutions and organizations is, of course, one in which they act as agents of the principles being the member states. And even the institutions that arose after World War II and that have been described as the international institutions of embedded liberalism, to a large extent follow this logic. John Ruggie has used this term embedded liberalism, and he describes those institutions as ones with an orientation towards free trade and open borders, while at the same time resting firmly embedded within national political systems which are able to absorb the shocks and irregularities of the world market. International institutions thus established are essentially a form of intergovernmental governance which enable national governance to function effectively. That was the basic idea. However, this whole notion, this whole idea of embedded liberalism focused very strongly on the content of those institutions. It did, in a sense, the term did not reflect the decision-making logic of those institutions. And for the method of decision-making of those institutions, I suggest something like executive multilateralism. And that term, not embedded liberalism, but executive multilateralism, essentially describing a process, a decision-making mode in which governmental representatives, mainly cabinet ministers, from different countries coordinate their policies internationally, but with very little national parliamentary control and quite away and quite distanced from public scrutiny. In that sense, multilateralism is something that is a decision-making open essentially to all states involved in the issues. They, to some extent, include a notion of generalized principles of conduct. They create expectations of diffuse reciprocity. All those processes usually associated with multilateralism, but at the same time, and this aspect was neglected for a long time, multilateralism in this post-World War II sense also means that the decision-making process was heavily executive-centered, since those rules of embedded liberalism were negotiated and implemented nationally without the contribution of the parliaments and without the systematic incorporation of national and transnational non-governmental actors. And the argument now is this notion of international institutions reflects, or this description of international institutions reflects quite adequately the understanding of intergovernmentalists. But that has changed. And the argument that it has changed rests essentially on two elements. First of all, a change in quantity. The basic argument is that the quantity of those international institutions which involve prescriptions for national political systems has grown dramatically and extremely strongly. I mean, take the maybe easiest but maybe also very telling number, the number of multilateral treaties. I mean, that is, in this counting, I think more than 10 member states have signed. The number of those treaties have grown from 150 in 1960 to 517 in 2005. That is all about the same growth rate as international trade has grown in this time period. So it is a significant growth, and it is a growth that is not far away from some of those indicators which are used when people talk about globalization. That is one thing, and I will explain later why I believe that this change in quantity is important for the issue whether or not those institutions can be considered as tightly controlled by the member states. The other issue is that the type of issue that is regulated by those institutions has changed as well. Take, for example, the classical case of a traditional post-World War II embedded liberalism institution. Take GATT. What did this General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade actually regulate? It had three distinctive features. First of all, the states were the ultimate and exclusive addressees of the regulation. They were asked to issue directives not to increase custom tariffs or to apply them in a discriminating way. The objective of the regulation, also in all of those arms control agreements and so on, essentially was to influence state behavior. And if it was possible to change state behavior, the institution was successful. Those regulations that were part of those traditional international institutions took effect at the borders between states. And in this sense, they primarily constitute a form of something that can be labeled interface management, regulating the transit of goods and beds from one border to the other. The regulation essentially developed the grip the moment when this good or bad passed the border. Quite obviously in the case of tariffs. The moment when the good passes the border, the tariff applies. The third feature that I would like to focus on here is that, I mean, it's always easy in a posteriori perspective to say it was a simple issue, but if you compare it to current issues, it was an issue of relatively little complexity, and the effects of having tariffs or of not having tariffs were quite clear to all the states involved. There were pretty reliable models what it meant to increase or to lower tariffs. If you compare this to, let's say, for example, the typical case of CO2 reductions as a typical issue of international institutions of these days, there you can see that exactly those three features have changed. The ultimate addressees of these regulations, like for example CO2 reductions, is not anymore only the government, it is essentially societal addressees. Even if the state tries to implement the goals of the international institutions, there has still to be done a next step, and that is that the societal actors have to change their behavior, otherwise it is not effective. So in this case, the consumers and the industries. In that sense, the addressee has changed, the final addressee. The primary addressee is still the state, but the final addressee has changed, and that is now societal actors. Secondly, those new institutions are no longer merely concerned with interface management. The reduction of pollutants requires regulations that take effect behind the national borders, within the countries, on the countryside, so to speak, and not anymore at the borders. And that is also true if you look for the development of the GATT regime to the WTO regime. I mean, the traditional one was tariffs, something that took place at the borders. Nowadays it's subsidies and regulations, and that is something that is behind, a behind the border issue. Thirdly, as I mentioned, I do argue that the effects of taking or not taking certain actions, for example, in the area of CO2 emissions, are more complex, are more complicated. It is not only economic effects, it's highly contested ecological and political effects as well, so the issues became more complex. If all this is true, what I have described so far, then this has institutional implications. And all of those implications point into the direction that these institutions are equipped with institutional components and features that undermine the notion of being tightly controlled by the member states. First of all, the quantity leads essentially to a situation in which the collisions between different regulations, between different international regulations and between international and national regulations just grow enormously. The whole issue of collision becomes an issue in international politics, with the result that there is a significant rise to be observed in the last 10 or 15 years of dispute settlement bodies. Dispute settlement bodies, but of course imply that there is in the end a decision which is not anymore based on the idea of consensus of all the member states involved, because the dispute settlement involves the possibility that there is a decision which goes against the interest of one of the involved states. So quantity leads to an institutional feature that undermines the notion of tight control. The fact that we are dealing much more with behind-the-border issues than 60 years ago or 50 years ago or 40 years ago leads to an enormous rise of verification problems. It's extremely easy when you have border issues to find out whether there is high or low compliance. I mean, whether you raise tariffs or not is no verification problem. It's easy to see for the exporter whether he or not has to pay tariffs. In the case of behind-the-border issues, things become much more complicated. The verification problem grows significantly, with a growing need for international or transnational verification agencies, which also, and again, lead to a situation that the decisions of those institutions, be they international or transnational, essentially get out of the control of the member states. The member states that have subscribed to the human rights regulations do not control the monitoring agency which is essentially Amnesty International. So there's again an element in which the consensus of the involved member states essentially gets undermined. I would also argue, especially with I know that is probably the most difficult and the most problematic one, but I would also argue that as a result of the growing complexity of the issues, there's a certain tendencies to give, how shall I put it, international knowledge agency an increased role, to have data gathering institutions on the international level, to have institutions on the international level who essentially give the technical knowledge and decide about the technical differences. I mean, in the climate issue, of course, the IHDP plays such a role in the climate panel report. These are also institutions which essentially provide the member states with some data and with some results which could easily go against the interests of all the member states. And therefore, as a result, a dense network of international regulations and organizations of a new quality and quantity has developed, and these new international institutions are indeed far more intrusive than the conventional international institutions of embedded liberalism. And this intrusiveness, of course, implies the idea that it is not anymore possible to say those institutions are just agents of the principles and the principles tightly control those international institutions. That would be the first part of this argument. And the second part then is societal actors begin to realize that this change is going on. They begin to realize that those international institutions are not anymore just technical matters in service of their government, but that they realize there are independent decisions made on this level, not independent, but in a sense autonomous decisions made on this level. And this is something that, of course, creates the impression that there is an institution outside of those nation states which develops an element of rule, of power, and therefore there is a need to legitimate those decisions. There is an understanding that those institutions change their character. They need to be measured with different criteria that the traditional understanding of international institutions involved. It's not anymore effective problem resolution and national interest. It is more the logic of legitimate governance, issues of fairness, of democratic legitimacy, even of justice come into the play. In this sense, those international institutions and international politics to some extent as well is then no longer to be evaluated based on the yardstick of political wisdom and efficacy. Instead, the evaluation of international politics is subject to the criteria of legitimate political order. And this, if this is true, it can be measured against the argument sociologically with the fact that there is something going on in this, on the side of societies in the way they handle those international institutions. And I would argue this takes place in two dimensions. The first dimension is that societal actors subscribe increased relevance to international institutions. That's the cognitive part of it, essentially. That they indeed, it should be shown that they indeed realize or believe, I mean, this is independent of the truth value of the first statement, that they begin to believe that those international institutions are of more importance. And here, I mean, you could look to some of the survey data which is around. Essentially, even if there's a growing dissatisfaction with some of those international institutions, like, for example, the EU, there is a clear recognition that the importance of those international institutions grow. If you look, for example, just to the Eurobarometer data, the question whether the EU is important and whether it has a high influence on politics is growing, while at the same time the question of satisfaction and of support for the European Union is going up and down. Another indicator for this growing relevance clearly would be that almost all groups which have saw the need to found interest groups on the national level by now do it on the European and international level as well. In a sense, one could argue, and there is some data and some interview data out, that many, especially companies, by now consider it as more important to have an interest group office in Brussels than in Berlin. And that is also, of course, a sign that societal actors consider those institutions as quite important if they think that they should have their office around there. So that is the relevance issue, and then of course there's also the politicization issue in the more narrow sense, and that is the growth of opposition, the growth of societal opposition against those international institutions and against their activities. And here clearly we do have quite different versions of it. We have the version of outright resistance that can be to some extent. I mean, you can have a debate whether this is really an indication for what I describe, but what you see currently in London, but you have seen it in Seattle, in Geneva. How do you? Geneva, right?
Genoa.
No, Genoa. I mean Genoa. Copenhagen and some other places where you essentially could observe direct protest movements, and you can of course also see it by the fact that the European Union obviously has increasing problems to create social acceptance and to get support if there are any referendums. So I mean there's a growing resistance on the level of social organization. There is a growing resistance, and that can be also shown in terms of data, that more international treaties get rejected or at least amended by national parliaments. And thirdly, of course, we are not only talking about opposition, we are also talking about an increased use of those international institutions by the same actors. I mean, to some extent, international institutions are used in order to achieve certain political purposes by societal actors. I'm talking, of course, about some environmental groups. I'm talking about groups which work in favor of anti-corruption and all those things. There you have the tendency not anymore to go to your national government in order to ask them to achieve something on the national level, but essentially to address those international institutions directly. So those would be some of the indications for growth in politicization, mainly by way of opposition, but also to some extent by the use for the development of positive regulations of those international institutions. So, essentially the intergovernmentalist critique of cosmopolitan views of global democracy is based, so my argument was, on two empirical premises. The first is that international institutions are considered as tightly controlled by their member states, and the second is that this notion of delegated authority implies that international organizations are seen by the people as something that does not need to be politically legitimated. And my argument against, my empirical argument against this normative standing is essentially that both of those premises do not apply anymore because international institutions have changed in the age of globalization. First of all, they do develop institutional features which undermine the notion of tight control by each member state, and secondly, they get politicized by societal actors, and therefore there is an increasing demand for the legitimation of those international institutions.
Okay.